Well, I'll get going and as I talk, people will settle in a little bit. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome to this June edition of our Policy Research Talk series. As some of you know, these are a chance for us in the research group to share with each other and also to share with others outside the research group, both inside and outside the World Bank. Also, a warm welcome to our audience on WebEx and on streaming. Today's topic, strengthening African wildlife and fisheries conservation, is particularly timely. We just celebrated the International Day of Biodiversity on May 22nd. Sub-Saharan Africa is central to global biodiversity efforts, and as it is home to the world's most intact ecosystems and wildlife populations. But marine and wildlife species face many threats, from overfishing to poaching, which makes conservation efforts crucial, not only for the species involved, but to bring economic benefits to people and communities, from improving livelihoods to supporting food security and tourism. Today's presentation will present insights from current and emerging trends and research in and on African conservation policies. To guide us today, we're joined by Gabriel Englander. I'm very pleased to introduce him. He's an economist in the Development Research Group's Sustainability and Infrastructure team. He uses large spatial data and causal inference economics and econometrics to understand how policy and illegal behavior affect wildlife conservation outcomes. Gabe's research priorities include marine fisheries, elephant poaching, bushmeat consumption, and deforestation. Prior to joining the bank, he was a postdoctoral scholar in the Environmental Markets Lab at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He received his PhD in agricultural and resource economics from the University of California, Berkeley. I'm also delighted to welcome today our two discussants, Charlotte de Fontebourg. I even asked you to tell me how to pronounce it. I had the French pronunciation in my head. Sorry. Charlotte de Fontebourg and Ellison Wright. Charlotte coordinates the bank's fisheries and blue economy work in Southeastern Africa. Before she took on this role, she was the global lead for the blue economy, where she helped shape and design the bank's blue economy approach and was program manager for Pro Blue. She's co-authored many of the bank's seminal publications on fisheries and the blue economy, including The Sunken Billions Revisited and Riding the Blue Wave. She holds an MSc in Sea Use Law, Economics and Policy from the LSE and a PhD in Marine Studies from the University of Delaware. Ellison is a senior environmental finance specialist in the East Africa Environment Department with over 20 years of public and private sector experience leading strategic environmental and finance initiatives. He currently co-leads the Wildlife Conservation Bond, WCB, operation in South Africa and a similar pipeline project in Rwanda. He also co-leads sustainable landscape management and nature-based tourism projects in Zambia. He holds an MBA, MS, and finance degrees from the University of Maryland, where he also completed the Life Sciences Scholars Program. So the structure today will be about 45 minutes from Gabe, and then 5 to 10 minutes for each of the discussants, after which we'll open this up for Q&A to the in-person and online audience. This session is being recorded, so by participating, you're agreeing to that. And also, if you're not speaking, please do mute your microphone. Over to you, Gabe.
Thank you, Dion. I also want to thank Ryan and Claudia and Michelle for helping to organize this event. And of course, discussants Ellison and Charlotte. All of you for coming in person online. I'm excited to talk with you today. And I think I will enter the rectangle. Well, no, I'll stay over here. Okay, so I think there's two ways to approach conservation research. You can begin from an ecosystem services perspective. So the belief that animals, plants, fungi produce the air, water, and food we need, and try to value those services. and that can make the case for conservation to policymakers. And the second way is to begin from the premise that biodiversity has intrinsic value, separate from stuff we get from it. That's usually where I begin, but I am increasingly persuaded of the value of valuation for converting the non-converted and communicating to policymakers. And ultimately, I think both approaches have the same implications for policy, but it's a conceptual difference. I've come to focus on Africa in the last couple of years because I now believe that it's the most important region for conservation for two reasons. The first is that it has the most intact landscapes and megafauna that we all know about, all the way down the trophic ladder. So there's a lot to conserve. And second, there's potential for great improvements in conservation policy effectiveness. The last point I want to make before getting into the three papers I'll show you today is when I read or talk with people or listen to podcasts about conservation in Africa, the most common narrative is one of unending loss of local species extinctions, habitat conversion, enabled by corruption, insufficient financial resources for conservation. And as I've done this research the last few years, I've found that this narrative is too simple, and it's a slight distortion of reality. There are things that are working, and things that are not working. There are feasible improvements that can be made. So that's the common theme for the three papers I'll show today. And we will begin on land, and then we will go to sea for the second and third papers, because fish in the ocean are also wildlife. Protected areas are the core of wildlife conservation around the world, places for animals and plants to live out their lives. And they're particularly important in Africa, where they cover 16% of total land area. However, parks in Africa are often not as effective as they could be, because managers are unable to prevent hunting within the park. The park could be in an active war zone. The park doesn't have enough financial resources. The park is not on the technological frontier. The management practices they use. And so partly for these reasons, there's a trend on the continent of governments inviting NGOs to manage parks on their behalf, or to collaborate with them in the management of that. And so in the first paper, we study the largest of these NGOs, called African Parks, that has what's called a fully delegated model, where during the contract period with the government, they have full responsibility for raising all of the money for the park operations. They hire everyone. They tell people how to, they manage the park themselves. African Parks is interested in a particular kind of park, those that are large, that contain or could contain large megafauna and functioning landscapes, places where the full ecological and evolutionary processes can unfold. They've expanded over the last couple of decades, coming to manage 22 parks in 12 countries in every subregion of Sub-Saharan Africa. They are the largest, but close behind is Wildlife Conservation Society, World Wildlife Fund. This is quite a common phenomenon in Africa. African Parks has a standard operating protocol that they apply in each of their parks, and their management model has 5 pillars. The most important of these pillars is law enforcement, because they believe that if they can't prevent hunting within the park, then there won't be wildlife in the park. So when they come to manage a park, they hire more rangers, they give them the best equipment, training, they use software to record what they see on patrols to decide where they patrol. I'm hearing a slight, is the audio okay? It's okay? Okay. They have 4 other pillars. So community development means funding and building schools and health clinics in the nearby villages. Restoration means if rhinos have been lost from an area, they will bring in rhinos from somewhere else and reestablish the population. They try to increase tourism to the park, and they build electricity and road infrastructure to facilitate tourism and the law enforcement operations. I'm always asked why a government would want to transfer an asset like a national park. And there's a couple of reasons that I've already alluded to. So the first is most parks in Africa lose money. So this is an opportunity to take a cost off of the budget, because African Parks is going to turn around and raise money from the European Union, from large foundations, instead of governments needing to fund it themselves. Governments might also believe that AP is going to be a better manager than they are, whether because they can raise more funds, whether because they can avoid corrupt hiring practices. And finally, governments might think that AP is going to be able to bring in more international tourists than they would otherwise be able to do. So we are comparing AP-managed areas, the red polygons, to the purple parks. These came from an internal study that AP did a couple of years ago, where they said, we think we have a successful management model. We've expanded in the past. We'd like to continue expanding in the future. What are the other government-managed parks in Africa that meet our criteria for being large, functioning landscapes that we would like to manage in the future? So we're going to compare changes in outcomes in the red parks to changes in outcomes in the purple parks that are always managed by governments. So the main set of outcomes we want to evaluate relate to wildlife conservation, because this is the primary purpose of parks. There's a lot of publicly available data on wildlife in Africa, but the work hasn't been done yet to harmonize it, to make it comparable to each other over space and over time, to form it into panel data that researchers can use. And I think it would just take 10 or 20 computer scientists working for several years to produce this data. So I think this would be a great investment for someone to make. It hasn't been done yet, so we can only use 2 data sets. The first is called the Monitoring the Illegal Killing of Elephants program. So this is going to measure the amount of elephant poaching in parks. And the second comes from an app called eBird, which anybody can use on their cell phone. And we're able to use it because eBird has columns for how many people looked for birds, how long they looked, how far they traveled in doing so. So we can at least control for the survey effort to make the observations comparable. So those are the 2 wildlife data sets that currently exist in Africa that are panel data. Similarly, for tourism, parks have their own administrative tourism data, but you have to go park by park or country by country to collect it. And so this is another area where if someone was determined, they could create a harmonized panel data set of tourism, which would be another thing that's valuable. It hasn't been done yet, so we use 2 proxies, eBird again, and iNaturalist is a different app. You can also submit observations of plants and animals other than birds. And both apps geolocate and timestamp the observations. So if we see an observation coming from inside a park, say, okay, that's a visit to the park. Those are measures of tourism. Third, we're interested in economic development. So this is predicting from daytime satellite imagery, asset wealth as measured in the DHS. Fourth, we're interested in whether armed conflict changes, because African Parks is going to try to increase enforcement. And so that could increase or decrease security in the wider region near the parks. And then to understand mechanisms, we're going to use survey data from the Management Effectiveness Tracking Tool to try to understand if there are changes in these outcomes, why might they be occurring? What is African Parks doing differently than governments would do? we find that African parks is a lot better at wildlife conservation and tourism than governments. They're able to reduce elephant poaching by 35%, and they increase bird abundances, so that the number of birds, by 37%. For our proxies for tourism, we find increases of 37% to 47%. And there's little to no effects on conflict in nearby villages and in the park, or on asset wealth outside the park. The main mechanism that we find in the management survey data is African parks is doing a lot more monitoring and enforcement than governments would do. A few months after our paper came out, there was a different paper that studied deforestation as the outcome, which was not in our paper. And they studied all of the NGOs doing this work in Africa, so not just African parks. And they found so they call this collaborative management, so NGO involvement in park management reduces deforestation by 55% compared to government management. So let's go to the ocean now. And this paper is a modeling exercise. Countries own the resources within their what are called exclusive economic zones. So beginning from the shore, going out usually to 370 kilometers, all the minerals, fish, and they can choose to sell the right to fish in their waters to foreign fishing fleets. So that's what we're going to study, are these foreign fishing access agreements that African countries sign. One example of an agreement is between the European Union and Senegal. So in 2019, EU vessels paid $90 per ton of tuna caught in Senegalese waters. The motivation for this paper is noticing that if you compare the $90 to what the EU vessels earn when they sell the fish at the dock, it's quite a small fraction, so $1,700. So it seems, just from comparing those two numbers, that Senegal is not capturing a large fraction of the value of its natural resources. One comparison point for this statistic is to countries in the Pacific that have formed a OPEC for tuna, called the Parties to the Nauru Agreement in the late 1980s. And so these 9 countries set a cap on fishing in their collective waters, distribute a fraction of the cap to each country, and then each country can sell their share for as much as they can get for it. So in 2019, these Pacific Island countries earned $454 per ton, so a lot more than Senegal got. And when we look at all of the publicly available access agreements, we find that African countries earn systematically less than these 9 Pacific Island countries. And so our research question is, what if African countries did the same thing as these Pacific countries and sold fishing access as a block? There's many differences that could explain the larger access fee earned by Pacific countries compared to African countries. These explanations range from differences in enforcement, the level of fish populations, the composition of fish, distance to final markets, differences in corruption. All of these potential explanations are difficult or impossible to change in the medium term. But one difference that is actionable is this market power dimension. So to study this, we need a model that can include market power on both sides. We, of course, need to allow for market power on the supply side, because we want to say, what if Africa formed a cartel? But we also need to allow for market power on the demand side, because the European Union purchases fishing access as a block, just like the Pacific Island countries sell it as a block. So we're going to pair a calibrated bilateral oligopoly model with a model of fish biology in order to calculate how an African fish cartel would change the profits earned by African countries the catches of fish in African waters, and the level of fish populations. We're going to compare Africa to Africa. So two scenarios, the status quo, where each country is selling individually, to this cartel, where countries sell as a block and then would distribute the quantity to each country. The mechanism underlying the differences I'm going to show you come from the cartel underreporting the amount of fish they have in their waters in order to exert market power. This underreporting is going to reduce the equilibrium quantity sold and increase the equilibrium price that African countries get. We can see how the model works in this picture. So Madagascar is the median selling country in terms of fish biomass. The biomass is the tons of fish in the water. So we're going to aggregate fish across species in order to create a composite fish population for each country. That's what's on the x-axis here. And the first thing we're going to do is numerically derive the solid yellow line. So we're going to say, suppose Madagascar has a biomass of 2 million tons. What would be the bids of all the other selling countries and the buying countries? Find Madagascar's best response bid. And then the market clears, and there's some amount of access catch in Madagascar's waters. So we get this access catch policy function, the yellow upward sloping line. So you can see it's upward sloping because the more fish Madagascar has, the more access catch it's going to allow in its waters. The second thing we need to do is account for the fact that access catch is a minority of fishing in African waters. There's fishing by domestic, and then there's unauthorized foreign fishing. And so that's this blue line, all of the other catch that happens in Madagascar's waters. And you can see it's also upward sloping. So the more fish there are, the more people fish and catch. And then the total catch policy function is the vertical sum of the two. And the steady state that we're going to use as our point of comparison is the intersection of the solid black line with the green line. And the green line is how much Madagascar's fish population increases each period. And we want to compare this status quo steady state to a coalition steady state. So we will derive the access catch policy function in the coalition in a similar manner, but you can see that it rotates down. So when there is a fish cartel, Madagascar and all other African countries are going to allow less access catch at every given level of biomass in order to exert market power. We assume that the non-access catch policy function is the same. It might rotate downward if countries invest their greater profits in enforcement, for example, in which case the benefits would be greater than what I show you, or it could, of course, go the other way. But in any case, we assume it's the same, and sum the dashed yellow with the solid blue in order to get the dashed black, which is the cartel steady state. And so you can see that there's a shift to the right. So under a fish cartel, there's more fish in the water. So this is an ecological benefit. There's going to be less access catch because of the rotation downward. And there's actually going to be more non-access catch because there's more fish in the water for domestic and unauthorized foreign to catch. And you can see that there's this kind of interesting result where total catch is actually going to be slightly higher, even though Madagascar is restricting the access catch because the fish population is beginning from a depleted state. If you fish less, you can catch more. So it's this kind of common win-win that you often get in fisheries if the resource is somewhat degraded. So here's the level effects across all the countries. And they're the same as direction as the picture I showed you. So under a coalition, the foreign access catch is going to decrease, which is going to increase the price that African countries get. The profit is revenue minus an opportunity cost term, because if you allow access catch, then that's less fish for other people to catch. Profit is going to increase by $37 million per year. I don't want people to take these numbers literally, but I think directionally they're correct, where revenues and profits would increase. And you can see in the fourth line that market power creates deadweight loss. So the foreign buyers are going to have less profit, and that decrease is larger than the increase in the profit of selling countries. Personally, I think that's okay because it's a distributional benefit. And there's other kinds of benefits you could add to this valuation beyond just the profit. You can see that non-access catch is going to increase, and it's actually going to more than compensate for the decrease in access catch. So total catch is going up because there's 16% more fish in African waters under the coalition. So I think that a fish cartel would be an ecological benefit and an economic benefit to African countries. Regional cooperation is very difficult. I don't want to underplay that. I'll just note a couple of instances of regional cooperation or the exertion of market power. So first of all, we've talked about how the Pacific has already done this successfully. The current implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is an example of ongoing regional cooperation. There's already the cocoa cartel in West Africa. I think the example of Indonesia exerting market power requiring processing of nickel because it has such a large share of terrestrial nickel reserves is interesting. And then in some of the countries in the Sahel that have had coups recently, a lot of the rhetoric of the new leaders has been quite resource nationalistic, and they are renegotiating agreements with foreign companies in order to try to get as much money as they can for their natural resources. So I think that this fish cartel idea is in the spirit of the times, and I'm still putting it out there. The last paper I want to show you is still in the ocean, but I'll return to causal inference methods. This policy is called inshore exclusion zones. So these red areas, all industrial fishing is prohibited. Close to the coast, these are the richest, most productive fishing grounds. They're the easiest, they're the least expensive to get to. And so countries reserve these for their small scale artisanal fishers. The reason they do this is because 9 million Africans work as artisanal fishers, and because artisanal fishing provides important nutrition to populations. So there was a Nature paper a few months ago where they looked at 6 critical micronutrients, and they calculated that 300 million Africans get at least 20% of those nutrients because of artisanal fisher catch. So those are some of the reasons for the existence and prevalence of this policy. Existing research argues that inshore exclusion zones don't do anything, though, because African countries don't have enforcement capacity, and so they don't keep out industrial fishing vessels who do whatever they want, and so there's no benefit to artisanal fishers. Those previous papers did not use causal inference, and they relied on transponder data that vessels choose to use. So they choose to buy a transponder and keep the transponder on. We don't have to use that data anymore because now there's synthetic aperture radar data, which can see at night, can see through clouds, and it sees the metal hull of a fishing vessel, whether it has a transponder or not. And so if you compare the two data sets, as this paper did last year that published the data, we can now see 5 times more fishing vessels in African coastal waters. So we're going to use those data to evaluate the inshore exclusion zones of these 20 African countries. The IEZ begins at the coast and it extends out to the width indicated on the x-axis here. This is using the old transponder data for Sierra Leone. So on the right is outside of the IEZ, where potentially industrial fishing is allowed, and you can see it happens. But then right at the boundary, there's a discontinuous decrease of 88%, and continuing into Sierra Leone's inshore exclusion zone, industrial fishing remains quite low. So if you look at this transponder data, Sierra Leone looks really, really good. But we should want to see the radar data, which can see vessels without selection. And when we do that, the picture is a bit noisier. The discontinuous decrease is less, but it's still visually apparent and highly statistically significant. So Sierra Leone is one of the countries that is able to enforce its inshore exclusion zone and deter industrial fishing vessels from entering. The other countries that succeed in this are Nigeria, Liberia, Mauritania, Ghana, and Guinea. If we had relied on the old transponder data, we would have thought that about half of countries succeed in deterring. So it would have been a slightly over-optimistic picture. We look at things that could explain the success of the 6 countries. So, GDP per capita, the share of the population that works as artisanal fishers, general measures of institutional quality. And the biggest difference of the 6 compared to the others is in surveys of country fisheries experts, these 6 are the ones that are doing the most monitoring and enforcement, which makes sense. Who are the countries that deter? It's the ones who are getting out there and patrolling, boarding, and inspecting vessels. This 56% decrease is not the causal effect of the policy, because deterrence means there's more vessels just outside because of the policy. So the true counterfactual level of vessels is going to be lower than the red line on the right. And so to recover a counterfactual that is free of spatial spillovers, we're going to apply a bunching estimator. Gives us this black line. And so comparing the black line, which is the presence we would have had if the policy didn't exist, to the blue dots, which is what actually happened, we can calculate, for example, for Sierra Leone, that its IEZ reduces fishing vessel presence by 35%. Now, bunching assumes that vessels that would have been inside move outside, but they stay in Sierra Leone's waters. They stay in the exclusive economic zone of Sierra Leone. And in order to quantify benefits of the policy, we want to estimate an extensive margin effect at the level of Sierra Leone's entire national waters, its exclusive economic zone. So we do that with a discrete choice model, and we calibrate the key parameter, the disutility from locating inside an IEZ, to match the average percent reduction from our bunching analysis. And so that allows us to estimate an extensive margin effect, where we compare the observed level of vessel presence to a counterfactual of each country's inshore exclusion zone not existing. So we find that IEZs reduce total industrial fishing vessel presence by 8% to 20% across countries. We do a similar calculation to the previous paper in order to quantify changes to fish populations and artisanal fisher catch. And we find that the policy increases fish stocks and artisanal fisher catch by 4% to 53%. What does that mean? Well, in level effects, if you add it up, that's 2.7 million more tons of fish in the water, and it's an extra 324,000 tons of artisanal fisher catch each year. Returning to that Nature paper I mentioned earlier that converted artisanal fisher catch into micronutrients, this extra 324,000 tons each year is enough to fully meet the micronutrient needs of 6.3 million people. So this is just one policy in 5 countries. That's one benefit from it. I think the fact that previous research argued this policy doesn't work reflects a more general skepticism in economics regarding the enforceability of natural resource regulations in Africa. We find that for the important case of inshore exclusion zones, some countries are able to enforce them, and they get benefits from doing so. And the African countries that are not enforcing their IEZs can learn from the ones that are. If a country feels that it cannot manage its resource well for whatever reason, on land, working with NGOs can help. And at sea, working together across countries and get more money for countries that they can spend on whatever they want. But one thing they could spend it on is increasing enforcement. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks, Gabe. That was fascinating. Really interesting how these 3 in-depth studies can reveal sort of these really big picture policy takeaways. So let's turn it over to our discussants today. Charlotte, can we start with you? Unless you really don't want to, and we can ask Ellison.
We do it here and there.
Up to you.
Yeah.
Okay, Ellison, go ahead.
This is a clicker.
Oh, I don't need.
Okay.
First. Okay. Thank you for having us. And actually, my manager, Paul Martin, was supposed to be here. So you're getting the second class from my side, but first class from Charlotte. And she'll gladly take on the whole cartel question and all these other easy issues. So wonderful. And it's always good to be here with the research side of the bank, because you are always using your brains and you have all these big data and, you know, contacts and all these things. So it's really, really good. And we don't hear you talking about procurement and implementation arrangements and all these other issues that, you know, are also very important. So, I mean, the one thing that, and we have the pleasure of collaborating with Gabe and even other colleagues in DEC and in different related issues. But the one thing that we could start with, right, because we have these discussions, is why do you even need protected areas to begin with? Right? Why do we need these unique and charismatic species or any of these species, right? I think that justifying this in today's world is always helpful, right? Because even on your nice conclusions there, the last one said, well, no difference for people, right? Or for natural, the conflict and something else. So, you know, I think that's really the emphasis, and starting with the point of view of, you know, why you need these protected areas, why it's important for development, right? Why it's important for the most poor in the world, certainly in Africa. I think that's an important area because, you know, what's your alternative there? You know, do you have other alternatives that maybe will generate more jobs? Maybe will help you power entire big cities or entire areas. So these are questions that the leaders in the countries and everywhere are coping with. And I think that, to be honest, we're losing the battle drastically, right? On all development indicators, and our friend Richard Domani does it so well. A lot of them, the last many decades, are going up. We're seeing many improvements on health, education, you know, economic development, infrastructure, et cetera. But biodiversity is a huge, you know, decline. And in some cases, you know, even where we think we're getting good progress with reforestation efforts, enhancing, you know, the density of forests and so on. Just yesterday, I read something on The Guardian there that in Costa Rica, you actually can't find bugs anymore. You know, where you had a ton before, insects, now it's very hard to see them, right? Even in well-preserved forests that, you know, have done very well in many decades. So do we worry about those small insects? Do we only worry about the big five, the rhinos, the elephants, the other charismatic species? So I think that that's good. So where I think we need to kind of take this is, you know, why are governments not performing as well as these NGOs, right? And do these NGOs have, you know, a magic wand that they can get in there and just do a better job? and is that a better model, right? Let the public money go towards, supervising and regulating these types of players and have them do it. Or are you in some ways giving up your natural assets to, another entity that's going to do it? And I think those partnerships, I agree very much is the case. They've done extremely well for the last many decades, and they have delivered great value. But it's always a moving picture and a moving target to try to see how do you maximize the benefit to those local communities? How do you ensure that you have a sustainable resource that is also not relying on donations from Europe or from Africa, elsewhere, right? I mean, because I think that, for us to mobilize the type of resources that we need to protect all of Africa's protected area, it's very small, okay? If you call up some of your friends that have a few billion, you can protect every single one of Africa's protected areas in perpetuity, okay? And I'm talking about $10 billion or something similar. Meanwhile, for us to fix a few power plants and get them to be, ready for the future here, environmental justice and all these other things, or in a, just way, just transition, it will take that amount of money for just a few power plants, okay, to transition that. So if we can find money to, make these investments, whether it's for an airport, for a bridge, for a power plant, et cetera, why can't we find that money for protected areas, right? So I congratulate you on the great research and the different look. I think we definitely need to have a lot more focus and emphasis on this type of work, and we need to consistently make it applicable on the ground to influence also not just the World Bank's lending operations and work on the ground, but how we can mobilize more resources there. So I think we're trying on the grant-funded work. We have some lending also in Africa, but elsewhere for protected area management. But, it's an important area. And I think the growing emphasis on exactly how we fund these operations, who benefits, and the sustainability of that, and ensuring that it's done in a very environmentally and socially sustainable way. I think that's the big focus. And that's an area that, I think there's a lot of opportunity. And I like how you present it is don't look at the nitty-gritty numbers here. Look at the general trends. I think that's also what we need to do with, the broader efforts. So we're going like this, right? There is some wins. We work with black rhinos in South Africa. South Africa has done a tremendous job in turning around the huge losses of rhino populations, and that's a umbrella species that's supporting many other investments in not just in that country but in other areas. But those are not as broad as we would hope they are, right? So there are some great big wins. We also work in Rwanda, and African Parks manages 2 out of the 4 parks in Rwanda. And one of them, Akagera, they actually cover 100% of their operating expenses with revenues they bring in. So it's very few parks that actually, make money globally. So tourism can be an option, but, in a lot of places, these can be paper parks or parks that are just really difficult to get to. And who's going to go there, right? And how much money are they going to spend? So hopefully, again, I will very much encourage everybody here to get engaged, do more, leverage all this new technology and new investments that we can for conservation overall, and then trying to find the links between improved beneficiary opportunities, livelihoods, and certainly the wildlife space. So that's it from me. Hopefully that's okay, but we love to consume your work, and we want to make sure that our clients benefit as much as possible to all that you're doing, and to the extent that we can make it very actionable and practical and put it through our systems, right? It's got to be something that we can get approval for, procure, and then, make sure that it's the priority in convincing governments that conservation is more important or as important as health, as road and infrastructure. I think that's the challenge. And to the extent that we can show that this is supporting a growth agenda and benefiting the growing population, especially in Africa, I think that is our challenge. So, last point that I'll leave us with is in investments, you're always looking for things that are undervalued and that hopefully will be more valued. As I mentioned, this whole sector is something that is decreasing in size, less protected areas, less biodiversity, and so on, and the ecosystems that are all tied to them. But at some point, we're going to figure out that they're super valuable and put money behind it. So whether these are, a clever financing mechanism or biodiversity certificates or credits, how people are developing it, or any other way, eventually somebody's going to crack this, that, it's going to be a more valuable asset in the future compared to now. And these countries that have this great asset, hopefully they will be able to mobilize the type of money and use it very well. So that's the idea, is low valued asset today, great opportunities in the future. We need to find a mechanism where investors, public entities and others can actually put their money to work here, make money along the way, but in turn have these great benefits that we're all enjoying. So thank you.
Thanks. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much. That's not fair. That's a very tough act to follow from both Gabe and Alison. Thank you very much. Obviously, first to the organizers for this invitation, for a very, very challenging and thought-provoking series of points that have been made. Like Alison, I'm going to probably talk first a little bit about feedback on the modeling, on the research, and then I'm going to bring it back to bank operations, if I may. Alison and I are practitioners in East Africa, and what Alison didn't say is he's one of the rock stars who's doing the rhino bond, the chim bond, all the good bonds. So quite a bit of experience in this. So Gabe, love the idea of, obviously something brilliant is happening in the P&A with the vessel day scheme. Can we try and replicate it in Africa? So the good news is that we're looking at this. The bad news is that we've been looking at this for more than 25 years. This has been going around. I think it's really something we need to think about. But literally, I was in Senegal. Obviously, it was a different minister some 25 years ago having the same argument. We've had workshops. We've sent the people from the Fisheries Forum Agency to the Sub-Regional Fisheries Commission in West Africa. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what may be preventing us from transposing completely this model to Africa. Not that we're giving up, but let's just be super aware of the some of the issues we need to overcome. I would say there are three different natures. One is oceanography. The fish that are actually in Africa are not the same as the fish that are in the Pacific. A tuna is not a tuna, is not a tuna. You have the bluefin tuna, which is one of the most expensive species, most valuable species in the world. And then you have albacore, which bluefish tuna ends up as sashimi. An individual species reached $600,000 in Tokyo market. And then you have the albacore that ends up as fish flour or canned tuna. So unfortunately, Africa did not win the biological lottery the same way that some of the countries of the Pacific did. So interesting, we talked about the 9 members of the parties at the Nauru Agreement, and we need to think about, well, what about all the other coastal states, small island states in the Pacific that are not part of this? Precisely, it's not the right tuna, not in their waters, not at the right time. Okay, so I think it's important to think about it. There is something brilliant in the P&A system, which is that everything is regulated by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. You did a really good job describing the EEZs, 200 nautical miles. In the parties at the Nauru Agreement, you'll actually have areas of the high seas that are enclosed by EEZs. Now, according to the law, those countries cannot impose who can come in, but because they have generated this position of power where they can negotiate, as you rightly said, as a bloc, no country, no distant water fishing nation is going to come through the EEZ of those states to the high seas to fish. So they've effectively created a system that works beautifully in practice, where indeed the distant water fishing nations come and negotiate as a bloc. And when the vessel day scheme was created, the vessel day scheme is literally what it means. You buy a day of fishing in that whole area. You can go wherever you want. Basically, you're going to follow the species. It has more than quadrupled since it was set up. So those countries came together, set up a VDS. The day of fishing was X, and after a few years, it was 4X. I really liked what you said about the fact that the reason those vessel day schemes are so valuable is because of enforcement, monitoring, control, and surveillance. If you don't have a sustainably managed fishery, you're not going to be able to sell it for a high price. And then I would like to bring the final point, which is the political dimension. So tuna, by definition, are a migratory species. And as a coastal state, as an African state, you cannot decide who's going to fish your tuna, even in your EEZ. You're going to be regulated by regional fisheries management organizations, regional fisheries bodies. You have a duty to collaborate under UNCLOS, the United Convention on the Law of the Sea. Here we have a very mixed bag. The Western Central Pacific Commission in the Pacific is doing much better than most. It's not perfect. In Africa, we have two main ones, IOTC, Indian Ocean Tuna Commission for the Indian Ocean, and ICAT, International Convention for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna. Very different regimes, very different results. Let me just give you an example a point to illustrate the difficulty of managing tuna in the Indian Ocean. IOTC includes all the states involved, either coastal states or fishing states. So you can have Comoros or you can have Indonesia, and all those states need to come together. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of, again, I really like the modeling. I think it's brilliant, but then the reality becomes this geographic reality, this political reality, this biological reality. I had a quick point about when you compared so you talked about the cost that the EU pays to the African states, which is $90 a ton, presumably, and the revenue being $1,600. But you're comparing cost to revenue, and you should be comparing cost to benefits. So $90 is a tiny fraction of the cost that is being paid by the EU. So I also have a couple of technical points that I will share with you in writing. So now let me bring it back to what this means for the World Bank, what is going on in practice. First, the vessel day scheme, the Pacific, brilliant model. And I'm really happy to say that this is one area where the World Bank has done a fantastic job through the PROP project, Pacific Regional Oceanscape Program, where the World Bank decided to work with these countries, which are overwhelmingly dependent on these tuna resources for development. If you've been to the Pacific, if you've been to Kiribati, if you've been to Marshall Islands, there's very little going on. And this is the path to development for those countries. And the World Bank has a series of projects called the PROP projects, where we are really literally trying to help those countries maximize what they can extract from that. So I think, kudos to the bank on that. On the issue of artisanal versus distant water fishing, this is so important. So if you think about it, you're a tiny little state in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific. You have a tiny little landmass, a huge EEZ. In the Pacific, the most striking example is one where the EEZ is 54,000 times the size of the landmass. So you're one of those countries, you have a tiny little landmass, and you have an enormous EEZ. And here you have to strike this balance, because you will have this amazing resource, which is offshore. Tuna tend to be much further offshore, usually outside the IEZ, by the way, that you mentioned. But you also have coastal communities that depend on fish resources for food security, for revenue, for jobs, for everything else. So how do you strike this balance is the question. So I think here you're inviting us to think more about that. I think you have some really interesting figures that we can draw from. On the regional cooperation, I could not agree with you more. First, because some of those species are migratory in nature and they have to work through the regional fisheries bodies, but also because if you look at, I'm just going to use my example, which is East Africa, the blue agenda is not necessarily the strongest, and it is very difficult for these countries to achieve economies of scale. That can only be done through regional cooperation. So I'm very happy to say that in East Africa and what we call the Western Indian Ocean, which are all the coastal states from Somalia to South Africa, and the 4 island states, Madagascar, Comoros, Seychelles, and Mauritius, we just started a sort of a big analytical program where we are looking for ways to enhance this collaboration, this cooperation with support from ProBlue, the Trust Fund for the Blue Economy at the World Bank. So I'm going to leave it at that. And just to say thank you very, very much for asking these really, really tough questions. The devil's in the detail. I'm glad that we keep thinking about this and we keep looking for those. And then at the end of the day, sorry, I have to finish on a pretty terrible note, which is climate change. Unfortunately, this is going to wreak havoc completely. The species are going to move, acidification is going to happen, sea level rise is going to happen, increases in sea temperature is going to happen, coastal ecosystems are going to be destroyed, and basically the species are going to migrate. So whatever we have that works, you know, the Rolls-Royce of fisheries management in the Pacific, in the PNA, with the vessel-based scheme, is going to change. And in a way, it is the responsibility of the World Bank to work with all these states to be ready for this transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte, for those encouraging, challenging, and also a little bit scary comments. Before we open it up, Gabe, do you have any reactions to some of the discussion here?
No, I just want to express gratitude for having such knowledgeable discussants. Thanks for your comments, and looking forward to continuing to work with you and talk with you.
Great, thanks. If you're following on the WebEx online, please do raise your hand or put a question in the chat. Anybody here with the question for either for Gabe or for the discussants? Go ahead, Tabio.
Very interesting presentation, good discussion also. I have a question about the first paper that you presented. That you said that there is another paper showing that there is a reduction in, there is more forest after they started acting. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering to what extent the results that you see are through having a bigger forest, like birds, you have more birds if you have more forest, or whether they have some direct measures that protect the wildlife that is aside from the forest.
I'm not sure about the mechanism for the birds. I mean, we sort of argue that it's because of a reduction of hunting and better habitat preservation, so probably both. The reason we don't study deforestation in our paper is only about half of the parks actually have forest that are managed by African parks. You know, some are desert, some are savanna. So I would say a combination of reduced hunting and better, avoided agriculture and habitat conversion.
Gabe, thank you very much. It was super interesting. Just a technical question on the modeling of the fish for cartel. Does the demand from EU in this case stay constant to the continent Africa, or can it switch? Like, how is it modeled exactly?
Yes, so we model Africa as a market separate from other markets. We also study, what if the PNA dissolved? What if the Pacific countries didn't have their cartel? How much would they lose out? But we do not link the markets. Yeah. I mean, I think probably it would make the benefits less if you can go elsewhere. And I guess just to say to Charlotte, like, I think our goal in the paper was, because these efforts have been going on for so long, we thought that if somebody gave ballpark numbers of the benefits, this could be motivating to the efforts for regional cooperation. But if you were going to really do it, yeah, maybe you would want to study the whole ocean and allow this kind of switching.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I learned a lot. And thank you to Ellison and Charlotte for the great comments. I also learned a lot from that. I actually have a question for you guys, for Charlotte and Ellison. I'm wondering, like, to what extent, since, you know, it seems like regional coordination is going to be the name of the game on a lot of these issues. I mean, we talked about it during the GCP on forestry. You know, we need to think about the basins, the sub-basins, all that. Similarly for fisheries and all that. How do you see the portfolio of the bank in this, you know, area of work kind of lending itself to that thinking, right? I'm just like a little bit curious because we have all these regional MPAs and, you know, it seems like on forestry, there's a bit of movement, but do you see that coming up? Because that could be a really good coordination mechanism, you know, to have this discussion on coordination. Over.
All right. So I think we're with you. We want to do a lot more, right? But clearly it comes from the clients and they request it. And the clients being National Treasuries, Ministry of Finance, they have to say, this is our priority, right? And with a little bit tighter money, I think that the challenge is how do you balance, let's say, the policy loans, right? The priorities, including Mission 300 in Africa, and then other things. But I think that probably our friend here, maybe he wants to reply, George. He's just coming from the Central and West Africa area, and they've been applying a few MPAs there, trying to really leverage much larger investments. But in the past, a lot of our support to countries have been through grants, whether it's the Global Environment Facility, GEF, or some trust fund or something else. And that was always one or two protected areas, okay? But it still leaves little islands here and there, right? So how do you build corridors or help the countries achieve these goals, by 2030, have 30% of their land that are, effectively protected. And I think, again, you're not going to be able to do that with one by one. So with the bank, compared to many other partners are nimble and quick. They can do a small project a little bit easier in some cases, right? For us, ideally, we would have a government say, hey, we want support across our entire protected area management system, right? It can be bringing on African parks. I mean, African parks where they worked in Malawi, they started after convincing the government for many, many years to say, okay, we can come in and have this mandate and support you with one protected area. The government understood, went with another one, and then went with another one. And before long, they said, we want you to manage the whole system for us, right? Which is a challenge, hasn't happened yet. But for the World Bank, ideally, we would be able to apply all of the policies and instruments in a way that is cost effective for helping to mobilize a lot of things. And I think for the push for the bank of trying to maximize private sector participation and some of these other engagements, maybe there are opportunities to provide some financing, whether that's tapping into some sort of guarantee system, or there's more discussion around these debt for nature swaps, right? And I think work out of the deck and work from our economics groups, MTI and others, I think that is also helping a lot. But at the end of the day, we will see where things are going. I think we are in a period of transition that happens every 10, 15 years based on what's going on there in the countries and, requirements on the ground and with donors and others. But, I think, again, if we're able to leverage the great economic capacity that this group has and similar work to showcase the value and then translate that into actual investments, ideally not a small little support here and there, because those are super helpful too. But, at the end of the day, it's probably not our strength just to try to do small projects that take many, many years to implement. But the MPA approach, and maybe George, I don't know if you're going to ask a question, but maybe you can talk about the MPA work in Congo and how you've leveraged some of this work with a bigger group. I think that is probably a model we want to expand. And then similarly with the, call it the Myombo initiative there in Africa, there could be opportunities to provide some incentives so that governments request support in that, right? But I think that going back to the argument of why the country should prioritize, nature and environment versus health, education, infrastructure, et cetera, I think one way has to be with if you provide them grant or very low cost lending, then, ideally they may be able to get, more out of that dollar where they borrow 50 cents and they get another 50 cents that is a grant, let's say, provided by some other mechanism that provide these extra incentives. And if you do that across a big, landscape, then you're talking about transfrontier conservation areas across countries, across boundaries, and there are opportunities there. But Charlotte, you want to expand and clarify anything that I misspoke on?
You spoke perfectly. No, just that it applies on land and at sea. On fisheries, we had, so the PROP is a regional project. We had the West Africa Regional Fisheries Program. We had the Swallowfish Southwest Indian Ocean Fisheries Program. We are kind of pressing the reset button. We are rethinking a little bit. We are very, very lucky in Africa that we have a very strong regional integration director who's been pushing for that. And also we're very lucky that we have some sources of funding that allow us to step back, look at what happened, and think about it. So just a quick pitch. If you want to look at the implementation completion report for the Seychelles Swallowfish, which was the blue bond, there's a very good analysis of the added value of regional cooperation on fisheries. So we're thinking about it. We don't have the solution, but at least we're asking all the right questions.
Thanks. Do you want to come in? Yeah.
Hey, great work, Gabe. I really liked how you're using like eBird and quantitative measurements of performance. I think it raises a really interesting question at the World Bank, because right now, most of the time when we measure effectiveness of protected areas, we use a MET score, which is a standardized questionnaire to measure the effectiveness of protected areas. That leaves a lot of room for subjectivity and doesn't bring in any actual data on how things are being managed in terms of biodiversity outcomes, as well as income and income or quality of life for people surrounding protected areas. I think your work, I think it really brings in some of the discussion that needs to happen in terms of using data to measure performance. And in that vein, I was wondering, because I think the World Bank bills itself as the #1 financier of biodiversity action conservation terrestrially. And the African parks model is the most prominent in Africa of a movement that's quickly gaining steam. You have lots of new NGOs that are coming out with similar structures as African parks. You have WCS, WWF increasingly going towards more of an African parks model. I work in Central African Republic. They've divided every protected area in the country between African parks, WCS, and WWF. It'd be interesting, as well as combining some of your indicators around environmental protection, but also bringing in financial performance and the incomes inclusion of people. If we're able to have some kind of NGO indice of performance for financing received and length of time acting, because that there's billions of dollars going in, or at least hundreds of millions going into all these NGOs to do this kind of modeling. It would be interesting if there was some kind of performance indicator that then would drive better performance of protected areas by all these NGOs and non-government organizations. And then the third point I had when looking at it was, there's a significant difference between African parks and the counterfactual kind of government. But it's interesting because I think for me, it really just highlights because our partners at African Parks do a great job, but it just highlights as well, when African Parks comes in, they have stable financing for 25 years. Whereas when the government manages protected areas, they're dependent on donor resources normally. Those financing streams are inconsistent. A lot of the parks that you're probably comparing against are total paper parks that have $0, right? So I think it'd be interesting if there were actually protected areas managed by government that actually had stable financing, to see that performance as well versus African parks, because I imagine that the distance between the two would shrink quite a bit. But yeah, and as for also the regional approaches, a lot of the countries, like I work in the Congo Basin, a lot of the countries in the Congo Basin are already at a 30% conservation, 30% of land area designated to protected areas. I think, a lot of these are paper parks, and just basic management and financing would be really important, but it's also important when we look at a regional scale. It's people like Edward O. Wilson and a lot of the conservationists, they say if you want to avoid 80% of extinctions, you need to get to 50%. But when you look at pressures on land use, 50% seems very unrealistic, moving forward. But when you look at like the Congo Basin, for example, in Gabon, 65% of the land is under forest concessions. In CAR, the Congo Basin forest, 80% of it is under concessions. And we've actually done a lot of biological work in CAR in the past year, and found most of the wildlife in our area is not in the protected area, it's in the forest concessions. And there's a lot of data to show that reduced impact logging and forest management planning can have very significant impacts on biodiversity. So I think we need to look at how do we really mainstream biodiversity outside of protected areas, and things like forestry and agriculture. 50% of the land in the world is arable land, is dedicated to agriculture. These are really important areas that, as a biodiversity practitioner in the bank, we're not often engaged in at all. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, George. Yeah, I'll just reply to a couple. I noticed when I've only been to the Republic of Congo once, but I noticed that the different logging companies had really different practices in their forest concessions. And so it made me curious about the same thing. It'd be really interesting to study. I agree that African Parks has more money than the government managed parks we're comparing to. So I think that's a great point. But I think that that is part of the effect of African parks, is they can actually raise more money than governments would be able to. And that's probably at least half of the secret sauce. And I could check if that deforestation paper compares NGOs in terms of their deforestation performance. I'm not sure. And for effects on people, I think that we could do better. I'm trying to do better right now with Ellison in South Africa in terms of effects of parks on economic outcomes near to parks. We just used kind of one data set that somebody else made, but it wasn't a priority of the paper. It would be possible to do a lot better.
One more comment here, just to put it in context. This number is a little old, but back in 2019, okay, Malawi is a country where African parks managed, I think, 3 parks there. But the comment that I had from one of the senior leaders in African parks was, and this is again, Brighton, the head of the Department of Parks, the MPW there in Malawi, he said his budget was $275,000 for the year, okay, to manage all parks and do everything. And African parks basically spend $275,000 per park per month, okay? So that's kind of the difference that we're talking about in some of the countries, that yes, it could be much better management, much better, kind of effort underway, increasingly engaging the communities, generating revenues. But, in reality, it is just night and day. What is the difference in some of these countries? So why can some of the NGOs mobilize so much money, which, by the way, USAID leaving the sector has left a huge hole. It's not small, it's huge, huge, and we don't know how that's going to be filled. But basically, there is plenty of money out there, right? So how do we get the large philanthropists and, investment money to support that, I think is the big question. But again, your comment about having that money for the 20-year agreement makes a huge, huge difference. And it can really, allow them to do so many more things that a government entity that maybe doesn't pay its staff for a few weeks, a few months, whatever it may be. It's a big challenge.
First, just let me say I feel like I really learned a lot from your presentation, Gabriel, and from the discussant comments, Ellison and Charlotte. So thanks very much for that. Perhaps also reflects poorly on my base knowledge level, but it was really a really informative set of discussions. I want to follow up a little bit on the effects on people that you're indicating that you're hoping to do a little bit more work on. And I know in your presentation you only gave a very sort of short coverage of that. But I was struck by Ellison's interpretation of the findings as showing sort of no effect on people, and I'm guessing from the wealth effect. And I'll just mention, I'm sure it's on your radar screen, but that Atlas AI data is amazing, and David Lobel will be giving a talk here next week, I think, at the bank. So I think that will be really exciting to listen to. But these things are really challenged to do temporal comparisons and also cross-country comparisons. And when I've talked with them before about how they're doing their temporal stuff, it's something they really they struggle with, because it's ultimately these loading factors that they're using to impute the wealth rankings. They're really sensitive to sort of temporal changes, and they may not be stable across countries and this sort of thing. And so when I saw that zero effect, my reaction was more of a shrug of the shoulders and kind of, attenuation bias or any potential sort of changes, biases sort of being introduced there. And the comment more is just this encouragement to explore. There are other indicators out there that might not be quite as easy to grab and maybe won't look as comparable as Atlas AI does in terms of over time and over space, but might very well dominate in terms of signal or meaningful signal coming out of this. So there's a lot of small area. I'm not sure how fine you need this mapped out, but there's a lot of subnational work going on in many of the countries that you're working in. And so I would just say sort of maybe reach out a little bit more to some of our operations partners and doing the analytical work on this, because I think there are some pretty impressive databases out there for grabbing high resolution, at least spatially high resolution data on economic outcomes.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. Kind of after doing it, we realized, this isn't the best data set that we probably could have used. So I would do it differently.
Sorry, just last comment here, and I'm done. But most of these parks, they're in rural areas, right? And unemployment is very, very high. So even any economic activity, likely it's generating informal jobs, informal income, and these types of things. But there has been some research around economic benefits of protected area, and it's found tremendous actually impact. When you look at the direct, indirect, and induced job generation, it's very high, and as well as the alternative opportunities. But at the end of the day, bringing it back to kind of World Bank or some larger investor, et cetera, you can absorb a $5 billion infrastructure investment much easier than you can absorb some millions of dollars in these very remote areas where perhaps you don't have the turnkey solution of service providers, of other folks. So I think that also plays into when are you going to choose one project versus another, and how is that going to reflect kind of your achievements. So this is long-term efforts, and the things should be done on the ground are not that massive. In some cases, things are already being done in a decent way, but the alternative, especially expansion agriculture, the climate change Charlotte mentioned, and others, it's really, really going to be challenging to sustain.
Thank you for a great presentation and conversation today. I came here looking for inspiration. I'm writing a paper on, there's a lot of inspiration that came from all of you, but I'm writing a paper on biodiversity conservation and financial inclusion. So I was hoping to hear of stories of giving fishermen a bank account to help them, conserve tuna, or working with smallholder farmers so that they can protect some areas. And the stories that I hear here, very much connected to what you just said about scale, is about governments, international NGOs, intergovernmental corporations, so very large scale things. And I wonder if you could point me to something that has to do more with the people at the bottom of the economic pyramid and what they can do and how financial inclusion can make any difference. If you know of any story that I could take.
I'm going to take this one. It's a bit convoluted, but in the Swellfish series of projects, Swellfish is Southwest Indian Ocean Fisheries program in Madagascar. So again, bear with me because it's not straight. In Madagascar, when you look at fisheries, you always have to look at alternative livelihoods. So if you want to fix your fisheries, what do? You start setting up some measures. You're going to confiscate the wrong kind of gear. You're going to set up marine protected areas. As a result, the fishermen, you're actually going to start by asking them to do more and to pay a price, usually an opportunity cost. So what you do then is you have to have a slew of measures to help accompany those beneficiaries who are first going to be asked to bear the price. And in Madagascar, the most successful aspect of the project was not what we did at fisheries, but it was what we did with the communities in terms of alternative livelihoods, very real, very concrete. And then the biggest success we had was, they call it in Madagascar in French, they call it the 3 key. So it's a savings system done by the community for the community, and you have 3 keys to the lock, so nobody can steal the money. And it was perhaps a bit of a side effect of the fisheries project, but it has tremendous results. Why? Because it basically empowered the communities with giving them access to, it's a very small form of credit, but that really went to the bottom line. And when we looked at the results framework at revenue on the family level, that's actually where we saw a result. So on that, I would just say, just think a little bit outside the box. Yes, obviously, we hope that we fix some of the problems with the fisheries, but think about it as a whole. These are the people that you work with and that you work for. Acknowledge that, same with opportunity costs for protected areas, you're going to start by creating hardship, if you will, and then think creatively about what, at the end of the day, for women, it's most distinct. What they need is access to cash, access to credit. So these were the kinds of examples, like I said, almost accidental, but so transformative.
We'll just say also, look at the Global Wildlife Program that the World Bank is leading on that. They have a lot of good case studies and experiences, but, historically there in Zimbabwe, you had this campfire program that, brought together a lot of communities, and they did very good results. It's had a bit more challenge recently, but that's a good one. In Zambia, there are a few. Namibia, certainly a lot of different community conservancies. Kenya, you have these examples. Different parts of Mozambique also. So those are there. And I don't know if somebody in the Global Wildlife Program could share some of those experiences, but definitely go there. And then also you have many cases where poachers who were involved with illegal activity, once, they were engaged and provide opportunities, they become eco guards, and then some, become more involved with the park. So there are lots of those stories too. So it's not necessarily a small lending program or fintech type of thing, but it's very inspirational.
Thanks. We're reaching the end of our session, but we have 2 minutes. So I just want to turn it back to Gabe and just ask, given what you've presented today, the discussion, just share with us what you see as the key research agenda items, top level research agenda items that you see in the space.
Thank you. So I meant it when I said that I'm a convert to valuation now, like just the last 6 months or so ago. So I'm going to do more of that in the future. So one is with Ellison and in South Africa, benefits of those parks to people. That's research and cross support requested by South African national parks. And then on land, and then on water, I'm going to value these vessel monitoring technologies because it costs money to outfit a transponder on a vessel that cannot be turned off. But once you have it on, it's very valuable because you can make sure it's not fishing in the right place. So that will be a cool kind of value of information paper for monitoring and compliance that we hope will also have policy implications.
Great, thank you, Gabe. Just a reminder, the presentation today was recorded and all the materials will be available online in a couple of days. If you are a member of World Bank staff, you can go to our, you can click on the, capture the QR code there, and that'll take you out to our Decoded series, which is our AI-driven podcast series. Unfortunately, you still need to be inside the World Bank to do that. Gabe's papers are there, as well as 30 other papers presented in a chat format. With that, please thank you everyone for participating in person and online, and a special thanks to our presenters today and the discussants for taking the time and really contributing to what I thought was really a useful and interesting discussion. Thank you.